That's how on the second to last day of the job, the convict crew that tarred the plated factory roof in 1950 ended up sitting in a row at 10 o'clock on a spring morning drinking Black Label beer supplied by the hardest crew that ever walked a turn at Shawshank State Prison. The beer was warm, but it was still the best I ever had in my life. We sat and drank it and felt the sun on our shoulders, and not even the expression of half amusement, half contempt on Hadley's face, as if he were watching apes drink beer instead of men could spoil it. It lasted 20 minutes, that beer break, and for those 20 minutes we felt like free men. We could have been drinking beer and tarring the roof of one of our own houses.
Only Andy didn't drink. I already told you about his drinking habits. He sat hunkered down in the shade, hands dangling between his knees, watching us and smiling a little. It's amazing how many men remembered him that way, and amazing how many men were on the work crew when Andy Dufresne faced down Byron Hadley. I thought there were 9 or 10 of us, but by 1955 there must have been 200 of us, maybe more, if you believed what you heard.
So yeah, if you asked me to give you a flat-out answer to the question of whether I'm trying to tell you about a man or a legend that got made up around the man, like a pearl around a little piece of grit, I'd have to say that the answer lies somewhere in between. All I know for sure is that Andy Dufresne wasn't much like me or anyone else I ever knew. Since I came inside, he brought in $500 jammed up in his back porch, but somehow that gray meat son of a bitch managed to bring in something else as well. A sense of his own worth, maybe, or a feeling that he would be the winner in the end. Or maybe it was only the sense of freedom, even inside these goddamn gray walls. It was a kind of inner light he carried around with him. I only knew him to lose that light once, and that is also a part of the story. By World Series time of 1950, this was the year of By World Series time of 1950, this was the year the Philadelphia Whiz Kids dropped 4 straight. You will remember Andy was having no more trouble from the sisters. Stamets and Hadley had passed the word if Andy Dufresne came to either of them or any of the other screws that formed a part of their coterie, and showed so much as a single drop of blood in his underpants, every sister in Shawshank would go to bed that night with a headache. They didn't fight it, as I have pointed out. There was always an 18-year-old car thief or a firebug or some guy who got in his kicks handling little children. After the day on the plate shop roof, Andy went his way and the sisters went theirs.
He was working in the library then, under a tough old con named Brooks Hatlin. Hatlin had gotten the job back in the late 20s because he had a college education. Brooksy's degree was in animal husbandry, true enough, but college education in institutes of lower learning like the Shank are so rare that it's a case of beggars not being able to be choosers.
In 1952, Brooksy, who had killed his wife and daughter after losing streak at poker back in the Coolidge, was president. Was paroled. As usual, as the state in all its wisdom had let him go long after any chance he might have had to become a useful part of society was gone. He was 68 and arthritic when he tottered out of the main gate in his polished shoe and his French shoes. His parole papers in one hand and a Greyhound bus ticket in the other. He was crying when he left. Shawshank was his whole world. What lay beyond its walls was as terrible to Brooks as the western seas had been to superstitious 15th century sailors. In prison, Brooksy had become a person of some importance. He was the librarian and educated man. If he went to the Kittery Library and asked for a job, they wouldn't even give him a library card. I heard he died in a home for indigent old folks up Report Way in 1953, and at that he lasted about 6 months longer than I thought he would. Yeah, I guess the state got its own back on Brooksy. All right, they trained him to like it inside the shit house, and then they threw him out.
Andy succeeded to Brooksy's job, and he was librarian for 23 years. He used the same force of will I'd seen him use on Byron Hadley to get what he wanted for the library, and I saw him gradually turn one small room, which still smelled of turpentine because it had been a paint closet until 1922 and never been properly aired, lined with Reader's Digest condensed books and national geographies, into the best prison library in New England.
He did it a step at a time. He put a suggestion box by the door and patiently weed out such attempts to at humor as more folk books.
Fuck books.
More fuck books, please, and escape in the 10 easy lessons. He got hold of the things the prisoners seemed serious about. He wrote to the major book clubs in New York and got 2 of them. The Literacy Guild and the Book of the Month Club to send editors of all their major selections to us at a special cheap rate. We discovered a hunger for information on such small hobbies as soap carving, woodworking, sleight of hand, and hard solitary. He got all the books he could on such subjects, and those 2 jailhouse staples, Ernie Stanley Gardner and Louis L'Amour. Cons never seemed to get enough of the courtroom or the open range. And yes, he did keep the box of fairly spicy paperbacks under the checkout desk, loaning them out carefully and making sure they always got back. Even so, each new acquisition of that type was quickly read to taters.
He began to write to the state senate in Augusta in 1954. Stamos was warden by then, and he used to pretend Andy was some sort of mascot. He was always in the library shooting the bull with Andy, and sometimes he'd even throw a paternal arm around Andy's shoulder or give him a goose. He didn't fool anybody. Andy Dufresne was no one's mascot. He told Andy that maybe he'd been a banker on the outside, but that part of his life was receding rapidly into his past, and he had better get a hold on the facts of prison life. As far as that bunch of jumped-up Republican Rotarians in Augusta was concerned, there were only 3 viable expenditures of the taxpayers' money in the fields of prison and corrections. Number 1 was more walls, number 2 was more bars, and number 3 was more guards. As far as the state senate was concerned, Stamos explained, the folks in Thomaston and Shawshank and Pittsfield and South Portland were the scum of the earth. They were there to do hard time, and by God and Sonny Jesus, it was hard time they were going to do. And if there was a few weevils in the bread, wasn't that just too fucking bad?
And he smiled his small, composed smile and asked Stamos what would happen to the block of concrete if a drop of water fell onto it once every year for 1,000,000 years. Stamos laughed and clapped Andy on the back. You got no 1,000,000 years, old horse. But if you did, I believe you would do it with the same little grin on your face. You go on and write your letters. I'll even mail them for you if you pay for the stamps.
Which Andy did. And he had the last laugh, although Stamos and Hadley weren't around to see it. Andy's requests for library funds were routinely turned down until 1960, when he received a check for $200. The Senate probably appropriated it in hopes that he would shut up and go away. Vain hope. Andy felt that he had finally gotten one foot in the door, and he simply redoubled his efforts. 2 letters a week instead of 1. In 1962, he got $400, and for the rest of the decade, the library received $700 a year like clockwork. By 1971, that had risen to even 1,000. Not much stacked up against what your average small-town library receives, I guess. But $1,000 can buy a lot of recycled Perry Mason stories and Jake Logan westerns. By the time Andy left, you could go into the library, expanded from its original paint locker to 3 rooms, and find just about anything you want. And if you couldn't find it, well then, chances were good that Andy could get it for you.
Now you're asking yourself if all this came about just because Andy told Byron Hadley how to save the taxes on his windfall inheritance. The answer is yes and no. You can probably figure out what happened for yourself. Word got around that Shawshank was housing its very own pet financial wizard. In the late spring and summer of 1950, Andy set up 2 trust funds for guards who wanted to assure a college education for their kids. He devised a couple of others who wanted to take small flyers in common stock, and they did pretty damn well as things turned out. One of them did so well that was able to take an early retirement 2 years later. And I'll be damned if he didn't advise the warden himself, old lemon lips George Dunley, on how to go about the setting up a tax shelter for himself. That was just before Dunley got the bum's rush, and I believe he must have been dreaming about all the millions his book was going to make him. By April of 1951, Andy was doing tax returns for half the screws at Shawshank. And by 1952, he was doing almost all of them. He was paid in what may be a prison's most valuable coin, simple goodwill.
Later on, after Greg Stamos took over the warden's office, Andy became even more important, but if I tried to tell you the specifics of just how, I'd be guessing. There are some things I know about, and others I can only guess at. I know that there were some prisoners who received all sorts of special considerations, radios in their cells, extraordinary visiting privileges, things like that, and there were people on the outside who were paying for them to have those privileges. Such people are known as angels by the prisoners. All at once, some fellow would be excused from working the plate shop on Saturday forenoons, and you'd know that fellow had an angel out there who'd coughed up a chunk of dough to make sure it happened. The way it usually works is that the angel will pay the bribe to some middle-level screw, and the screw will spread the grease both up and down the administrative ladder.